Under a blazing, relentless sun, the young substitute hero stood alone amidst the vast silence of a barren landscape, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Breathing heavily through gritted teeth, sweat and blood mingled on his forehead as he fought back the overwhelming pain. Clad in heavy, battered armor splatter-stained with dark fluid, he gripped a massive, serrated circular weapon that dwarfed his frame. Looking out across the desolate battlefield, a grim realization settled over him. This place was nothing short of hell. Surrounded by the lifeless remains of monstrous foes, he whimpered softly to himself, unable to ignore the agony searing through his body. Yet as new abominations surged forward, instinct overrode his suffering, driving him to swing his massive blade in a desperate arc. With brutal efficiency, the spinning teeth tore through flesh and bone, crushing the creatures into grotesque sprays of gore. His eyes widened in shock and frenzy as warm blood splattered across his face, the madness of the battle consuming his thoughts. Giant serrated wheel smashed directly through another adversary, pulverizing its monstrous features into a violent explosion of visceral debris. The whirlwind of carnage finally slowed. He remained standing amidst rising smoke and severed limbs, battered but victorious in the solitary nightmare. Collapsed heavily onto the desolate dirt ground, exhausted and battered, his massive saw blade slipping from his hand as he looked up in despair. Lying helpless on his back, he grimaced at the severe wound torn open in his torso, cursing himself for letting his guard down in the heat of battle. Desperate to survive, he activated his weapon's repair mechanism, causing dark thorn-like tendrils to surge forth and bind the vicious blade. Dark, thorny vines lashed out violently, spattering blood into the air as they began the painful process of sealing his terrible injuries. Agony pierced through him as the biomechanical thorns dug into his flesh and steel alike, making him scream aloud against the unbearable pain. As the brutal repair completed, he leaned heavily on his weapon, panting heavily under the vast, bleak sky of the desolate battlefield. Slowly, his heavy eyelids fluttered closed as consciousness slipped away, leaving his body motionless on the frozen ground. Mysterious light shimmered around his floating name, marking the end of his nightmare on that bloody realm. Opening his eyes, he found himself no longer on the battlefield, but dressed in a school uniform in an unfamiliar, serene setting. Standing before him was a radiant, divine entity floating among falling feathers, introducing herself as Goddess Sanlus. She hovered radiantly in the center of the modest room, her divine aura contrasting sharply with the mundane surroundings as Tygo scrambled backward on his bed in total disbelief. Startled by her sudden arrival via teleportation, the young man demanded to know her identity. She calmly declared herself a deity whose realm was currently under siege by devastating monsters unleashed by the Demon King. Continuing her plea, the divine entity explained that to overcome this mortal threat, they required assistance from someone beyond their own realm, directly asking for his strength. This desperate measure stemmed from a fundamental absolute of her world. No creature native to that land possessed the power to harm the Demon King's forces. Elaborating further, she revealed that a secret curse cast by the Demon King rendered all local swordsmanship and magic completely ineffective against his ferocious subordinates. Striking presence, the goddess recounted how they gathered individuals from other worlds to act as heroes, while Tygo swallowed hard, feeling the overwhelming weight of her regal atmosphere. She detailed how these summoned otherworldly warriors were stationed in temples, granted the special blessing of foreign origin so they could wield the strength needed to slay the monsters. Extending her invitation directly, she informed the astonished teenager that he possessed the inherent potential to become one of these legendary heroes. Overwhelmed by the sudden decree, Tygo pointed at himself in utter disbelief, questioning how someone like him could ever be considered a hero. His doubts stemmed from his ordinary existence back home, defined by average grades, unremarkable athletic abilities, and a quiet life with nothing to truly boast about. He pondered the divine proposition, realizing that even someone as ordinary as himself might finally become somebody special in another world. As the majestic winged goddess, Sanlus formally invited him to journey to her realm, hope blossomed within his chest. His eyes sparkled with newfound determination, wholeheartedly believing that his true life was about to begin. Stepping forward, he walked alongside the goddess directly through a swirling portal of glowing light that opened inside his bedroom. He arrived at the grand headquarters of the San Luis Church in the sacred city of Agnorov. Inside the cathedral, Faria desperately pleaded with the newly arrived youth to come to her temple. Rika, the wandering swordswoman, expressed her outrage to the bishop about the temple being disbanded right when Koichi had fallen. Bishop remained calm, announcing that a revelation from the goddess had just been received regarding the temple's disbandment. Addressing Taigo Korea directly, the bishop ordered him to report to the 13th Division as a hero substitute. Confused by the sudden title, Taigo questioned what a substitute meant, while Faria grabbed his hand in desperation, pleading for his help. She held his hand, tears welled in Faria's eyes, her voice trembling as she desperately pleaded for his power to aid their cause. Stunned by her sudden display of emotion, he stood speechless in the grand hall as the priest observed quietly nearby. Single teardrop fell from her cheek, splashing softly onto his trembling fingers. Looking into her tear-streaked face, he felt the heavy weight of her desperation pressing down upon him. Raising his hand to accept the burden, he quietly agreed to step into the role of the substitute hero. Yet, little did he know that this single decision marked the true beginning of his personal hell. Shortly after, he found himself lying on the cold ground as thick, foul slime splashed across his face. Looking up in horror, his eyes locked onto a massive, ring-toothed abomination looming directly over him. The terrifying creature let out a hideous screech, its gaping maw dripping with visceral fluid. Helpless and cornered, he sat paralyzed on the ground as the giant monstrous worm towered over his frail frame. Overwhelmed by revulsion at the grotesque horrors towering before him, he recoils in sheer disgust. As the giant ring-toothed worms lunged down to devour him, he instinctively activated his defensive enhancement magic, encasing himself in sturdy bone armor to withstand the incoming onslaught. Focusing the magical flow into his legs, bone-like plates tightly bound around his boots, providing the immense athletic burst he needed to leap free. Propelled high into the sky by the magic power in his legs, he soared above the writhing monstrosities, looking for an opening to strike back. The fury born of desperate survival, he brandished his buzzsaw weapon, screaming out aggressive threats as he prepared his aerial descent. Plummeted down directly onto the massive beast, grinding the spinning blade furiously against its tough skin in an attempt to wear the creature down. Sparks flew wildly as the blade bounced off the worm's hide, leaving him in sudden frustration as he realized its hide was far too tough to penetrate. The giant worm thrashed angrily in response, forcing him to leap away and narrowly dodge its crushing counterattack. The terrifying creature reared up again with immense strength, slamming into the earth and creating a massive shockwave across the battlefield. Blasted backward onto his feet, he skidded along the ground, panting heavily as exhaustion and desperation began to set in. Stood his ground, preparing himself for the next terrifying phase of the battle. Before he could react, the gargantuan worm lunged forward, swallowing him whole into its gaping maw. Plunging deep into the dark, ringed gullet of the beast, he was surrounded by rows of razor-sharp teeth. Trapped within the crushing esophagus, he felt the tight, muscular walls constriction around him. Realizing its outer skin was impenetrable, he reasoned that attacking from the inside was his only viable path to victory. As the pressure mounted, oxygen slipped away, and panic flared in his eyes as suffocation set in. Desperate for survival, he invoked his magic once more, surrounding his body with bone armor to withstand the crushing force. Focusing his mana, he compressed the bone barrier into a perfectly smooth, hard spherical form. Utilizing this frictionless shell, he allowed himself to slide rapidly downward through the creature's tight digestive tract toward a wider cavern inside. The sudden splash, the sphere burst into the monster's stomach chamber, landing amidst a pool of highly corrosive digestive acid. Emerging from the protective shell, he caught his breath, relieved to have escaped suffocation, though the burning acid immediately began to sting at his armor. He stood ankle-deep in the acidic pool, realizing he had to act swiftly or be completely dissolved inside the beast's stomach. Looking around at the bones floating in the corrosive sludge, Indignation surged within him at the sheer number of victims this monster had devoured. Grasping his weapon tightly while spinning bone blades roared around him, he swore a fierce vow to eliminate the creature once and for all. Remains scattered across the stomach floor told silent stories of fallen warriors who had fought desperately to protect the realm before meeting their end. Reflecting on his former self back in his home world, he realized how much he had changed. He was no longer a bystander, but a hero bound to resolve this conflict. Facing the impending destruction, a grim race against time began. Would the beast yield to his assault first, or would the acid consume him entirely? Summoning every ounce of power, he readied his deadly spinning bone constructs to unleash the final, decisive strike. Unleashing the Slaughter Tempest Sphere, a whirlwind of razor-sharp bone blades tore through the internal organs of the giant beast. Violent surge of attacks completely shredded the monster's core from within, bringing its horrific rampage to a sudden end. Emerging from the collapsing remains of the giant worm, he shed his armor, exhausted but victorious, quietly acknowledging that the battle was won. He lay battered and bleeding upon the cold ground, his body broken from the fierce battle, forcing himself to crawl forward with the desperate realization that he needed to reach the temple to recover. Dragging his bloodied limbs toward the grand facade of the San Luis Temple's 13th Division, his arrival was met only with the cold, mocking label of hero substitute. As he stumbled forward, Marika, the wandering swordswoman, stepped into view, looking down at his shattered state with callous indifference while checking if he had dropped any valuable spoils. Nearby, Nun offered a potion, claiming it would help restore his strength as she handed the vial over. Without giving him a moment to hesitate, Marika grabbed him by the jaw and forcefully tipped the murky liquid straight down his throat despite his muffled protests. Foul liquid burned as it went down, sending a surge of sudden nausea through him as he clutched his face in pain. Seeing his distress, the women burst into cruel amusement, mockingly wondering aloud if the medicine was long past its expiration date. He gasped out a weak question as to why they would do such a thing. Marika leaned in close and sternly warned him not to get any foolish ideas. She reminded him with harsh certainty that this sacred domain belonged strictly to Koichi, and that Koichi alone was their true hero. Standing tall alongside her companions and looking down on him with absolute disdain, she drove the truth home, declaring that he was nothing more than a temporary substitute. She sharply cut him off before he could protest, warning him not to get ahead of himself and leaving him utterly speechless. As he limped heavily through the grand hallway, the crushing realization settled in that he had been utterly deceived from the start. He agonized over what it truly meant to be a mere substitute hero, frustrated that the goddess had kept such vital truths hidden from him. Pausing outside the massive doors, a deep sense of inadequacy washed over him as he accepted that he was nothing special compared to Koichi. He stared up at the entryway in silence, questioning why the true hero still lay asleep behind those doors. Inside the lavish chamber, Marika sat quietly beside the grand canopy bed where Koichi lay resting. Gently, tenderly touching his face, she voiced her longing, pleading for the sleeping hero, Koichi Hyuga, to wake up and speak to them once more. Leaning close with devotion in her eyes, she promised him that she would protect his place until the day he finally returned. Overcome by emotion, she drew near and pressed her lips to those of the motionless young man. In the dimly lit isolation of the bedroom, her passionate embrace of the sleeping hero continued in complete privacy. Leaving her behind in the inner chamber, the young substitute turned away, his boots scraping heavily against the floor. Overwhelmed by intense disgust and betrayal, he gritted his teeth in agony, realizing the reality of his existence was nothing short of a living hell. Yet, despite the nightmare surrounding him, a dark, unwavering resolve hardened his gaze. He swore to forge ahead alone, determined to eradicate every monster with his own hands, even without comrades. Calling his arrival, Taigo Korea reflected on how he had been summoned to another world by a goddess and designated as a substitute hero, a fate that turned out completely different from his expectations. As he walked through the grand corridors of the San Luis Church Temple alongside Goddess Faria, she openly expressed her disgust at the dusty, unkempt state of the passageways. Opening a heavy door, she coldly informed him that a cramped storage room would be his quarters, leaving him utterly bewildered by the dismal living conditions. He nervously inquired about his duties as a hero substitute. She simply commanded him to stay inside the temple before turning her back and bidding him farewell. Left alone in the hallway, he questioned why her attitude had shifted so dramatically from their initial encounter, feeling entirely misled about his role. Suddenly, loud beeping sounds resonated down the corridor, prompting him to trace the noise back to a mysterious, sealed doorway. Pushing open the heavy doors, he stepped into a grand chamber, where a small cherub statue stood atop a pedestal surrounded by a glowing magic circle. To his utter astonishment, the winged figure sprang to life, cheerfully greeting the substitute hero in an empty room. Startled, he stumbled backward as the animated statue burst into laughter and offered an apology for scaring him. Winged guide then revealed that this was the transfer room, urgently reporting that a nearby village had just come under attack by monsters. He stood wide-eyed with anxiety, stammering that someone needed to be called immediately, but the living cherub statue cut him off urgently, declaring there was no time and commanding him, the substitute hero, to go right away. Before he could object, light blazed beneath his feet as the transfer circle activated, sending him spiraling away under the cherub's final cry. Disorienting blur of warped space engulfed him as he was hurtled through the magical portal. Moments later, he materialized on solid ground, looking around in utter bewilderment at his new surroundings. Turning toward the smoke, a horrifying scene greeted him. A village engulfed in flames, overrun by violent, goblin-like creatures with bodies strewn across the dirt. Carnage was absolute. Vicious monsters mercilessly attacked fleeing, defenseless villagers and slaughtered those left behind. Paralyzed by shock, he could only stare at the nightmare unfolding around him, questioning what he had been thrust into. Panic seized him as he gritted his teeth, desperate and completely helpless, wondering what an ordinary person could possibly do in a tragedy like this. A faint cry caught his attention, revealing a young child crawling out from beneath the fallen body of her mother. As the child wept beside her slain mother, one of the roaming monsters turned its eyes toward the survivor, leaving the young substitute hero horrified as he realized the danger. He grit his teeth in absolute horror as a helpless young boy wept beside his fallen mother, completely unaware of a knife-wielding goblin looming directly behind him. Unable to stand by, the young hero charged forward with a desperate cry, hurling a wooden plank to draw the creature's attention away from the child. Goblin turned, startled by the sudden distraction, while the terrified boy remained crying by his mother's side. However, his reckless intervention proved useless, as the monster quickly raised its blade over the defenseless child once more. Suddenly, a heavily armored soldier burst through the debris, calling out an apology for his delayed arrival as he charged into the fray. Raising his weapon high, the knight announced the arrival of the Saint-Louis 6th Division, declaring the area secure. Though the immediate threat was neutralized, the tragedy remained as the young boy clung to his lifeless mother, while villagers looked on in sorrow. The child wept uncontrollably over his mother's body, his heartbreaking screams echoing across the ruined village. Watching the devastating scene unfold, Taigo stood frozen, overwhelmed by a profound sense of helplessness. He slowly walked away from the weeping child, haunted by his total inability to alter the tragic outcome. He stood paralyzed by the harsh reality of the world, trembling as sweat rolled down his face, realizing that weakness meant an inability to protect anyone. Clenching his fist until his knuckles strained, a fiery resolve took root in his mind. Had to grow stronger. Driven by this newfound determination, he approached the seasoned adventurers of the tavern, declaring his desire to slay monsters and begging them to accompany him to the battlefield. The group gathered around the table stared at him with varying degrees of indifference and skepticism, unmoved by his passionate plea. Rika flatly refused, pointing out that saddling themselves with someone weak would only lead to wiping out their entire party, while her companion questioned why they should bother. Intervening in the exchange, Jubiai suggested that Marika at least teach the young man basic swordsmanship, leaving him waiting nervously for her response. Bowing deeply, he practically begged once more to be trained, while Marika remained silent, her cold gaze weighing his sincerity. To his utter relief, Marika relented and commanded him to follow her, putting a bright smile back on his face as he realized she was willing to mentor him after all. Training commenced immediately in the courtyard, where Marika lunged forward, striking him repeatedly with relentless precision. Absorbing blow after punishing blow, he cried out in protest, desperately asking why he was expected to fight completely barehanded while she wielded a weapon. He reeled back under the relentless assault, spit flying from his mouth as Marika struck him again and again. Before he could recover his footing, she delivered a brutal kick directly to his chest, sending him skidding across the ground. Collapsing onto his side in the dirt, he scrambled backward in desperation, trying to put distance between himself and his unrelenting instructor. Standing over him with her wooden sword poised, Marika sternly demanded that he get back up, tauntingly reminding him of his goal to become stronger. Gasping for breath on the ground, he stared up at her in shock, unable to find the strength to respond immediately. Sitting back on his heels, he wiped his mouth and accepted the harsh reality of his situation, knowing that complaining would change nothing. As he reflected on his position in this world, he acknowledged the painful truth that everything boiled down to his own weakness. Determined to change, he swung his practice sword repeatedly, convincing himself that if he became strong enough to defeat monsters on his own, his situation would improve. Sweat poured down his face as he pushed through the fatigue, fueled by the conviction that gaining strength was the only way to earn everyone's acknowledgement. Yet, around him, the party members looked down on him with cold contempt, whispering among themselves about his weakness and questioning why anyone would pity a substitute hero who relied on others. He swung his wooden blade repeatedly, counting toward 1,000 repetitions while the rest of the party observed his relentless practice from the archway. Watching from nearby, the spirit archer observed his unwavering dedication in quiet solitude, her expression unreadable. Out in the vast open plains before distant snow-capped mountains, a new challenge awaited. Surrounded by a horde of aggressive goblins brandishing crude clubs and blades, he stepped into the field ready for battle. As the monsters closed in from all sides, his focus tightened, analyzing their movements with razor-sharp concentration. The swift and decisive arc, his blade tore through his foes, dark blood spraying across the air. Cleaving through the remaining beasts effortlessly, he realized with quiet certainty that his intense training was finally paying off. Later, gathered around a stone table outside a grand estate, the party discussed their ongoing investigation into the true hero's mysterious illness. One of the companions explained that renowned bishops knew nothing of the affliction, though ancient labyrinth archives mentioned a sleep sickness from thousands of years ago. Adding to the bleak outlook, the swordswoman reported that all their local contacts yielded no further answers, leaving the hero's fate in uncertainty. She cursed in frustration over their inability to revive Koichi Hyuga, wishing desperately for a solution. Stepping forward, Taigo presented a magic tablet displaying his subjugation records, insisting he had grown strong enough to fight alongside them and begging for their attention. Facing a wall of silent indifference from the party, he held out the device, earnestly asking them to accompany him to the battlefield to hunt monsters. Without a moment's hesitation, she harshly struck the tablet out of his hands, coldly informing him that he was only getting in their way. The tablet crashed onto the floor with a loud clatter, while surrounding adventurers mockingly snickered at his humiliation. Turning away from the gathered party, he quietly retrieved his dropped device and began to walk away in silence. Fixing him with a sharp, uncompromising glare, she delivered a final dismissive instruction, telling him that if he was so eager to fight, he should go and fight alone. He stood rigid, processing the stinging weight of her complete rejection. Taking her words to heart, he set out into the wilderness on his own, continuously hunting monsters single-handedly to build his strength. Engaging terrifying undead foes in brutal close combat, he unleashed powerful blazing sword techniques to slice through his enemies. Standing victorious before a towering wall of infernal flames, he paused as a mysterious figure loomed ahead within the smoke and fire. He stood sharp and alert, his dark eyes locked onto the roaring blaze ahead, sensing a strange presence lingering within the heat. Beyond him, a massive wall of fire raged across the clearing, consuming everything in its path with deafening intensity. In the shadows of the inferno emerged a skeletal figure clad in a dark hood, its hollow eyes widening in shock at the spectacle before it. Through the blinding sparks and heat, a half-monsterized warrior materialized, half encased in demonic horn armor and enveloped in raging flames. Ferocious speed, the fiery warrior lunged directly at the cloaked skeleton, unleashing a torrent of bladed pressure. Observing the intense combat style, the skeletal entity realized who stood before it, recognizing him as the legendary solitary hero. Igo, half consumed by his demonic state, coldly declared that regardless of what anyone called him, he would wipe out every last monster. Sometime later, far from the battlefield, an empty, quiet hallway stretched inside a pristine guild building. Walking alone down the corridor, Taigo reflected on the title of the solitary hero, deciding that being alone was far better than risking betrayal again. Stepped out into the crisp air, leaving the building behind to face his lonely path forward. His eyes widened in sudden alarm, asking what was happening just as a window shattered violently behind him, spraying glass shards across the room as an incoming projectile burst. As he quietly pondered how far things would escalate, a sudden clatter shattered the silence outside his window. Startled, he whirled around just as a stone came crashing in, announcing the arrival of an uninvited guest who addressed him as the substitute hero. Following the commotion, a young woman leaped gracefully down from the rooftop, landing softly on the sill while casually clutching a bundle of food, pleased that he had noticed her presence. Stepping into the room with a tray of fresh bread, she cheerfully introduced herself as Falk Oculus, the spirit archer. She casually mentioned being the newest arrival at the temple, prompting a sweat-drenched response from the young man, who questioned whether her violent entrance had been an attempt on his life. Pointed out that if she was capable of climbing up on her own, throwing rocks was entirely unnecessary, to which she explained her desire to avoid being seen by Marika and the others at the main entrance. Ignoring his irritation, she sat down at the table and warmly asked if he was hungry. She offered him a bowl of homemade soup alongside the bread, but he stared down at the meal with intense mistrust, finding her sudden hospitality deeply suspicious. He bluntly asked if the dish was poisoned. She recoiled in shock and vehemently denied the accusation. Rising to his feet, he made it clear that he was fully aware of the resentment everyone held toward him and insisted he had no intention of causing any trouble. He requested only to be left alone, leaving the spirit archer looking down in quiet, somber sadness. She took a bite of her own soup to demonstrate its safety, proudly boasting about how delicious her culinary creation had turned out. However, as soon as the flavor hit her tongue, her expression twisted in shock as she realized the taste was actually horrendous. Flustered and embarrassed, she began rambling about misjudging the strange ingredients, leaving him simply bewildered by her clumsiness. To ease her distress, he offered a gentle apology, admitting that the dish had actually tasted fine at first despite her panic. Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped her skirt, deeply touched by his unexpected kindness after such an awkward blunder. Looking up at him with newfound trust, she began to open up, sharing her thoughts about how things used to be in the past. Her mind drifted back to a year ago, remembering a time when the dynamics among their companions were vastly different. In that memory, Koichi was being playfully hand-fed fruit by a glamorous, fox-eared companion who doted on him continuously. From her lonely vantage point across the room, she had watched them sit together on the sofa, feeling completely left out. The fox-eared woman had abruptly dismissed her, telling the young girl to go play outside so the adults could have private time. She complained grumpily as she was ousted from the room, insisting she was no longer a child. Wandering through the hallway with a pout, her attention was suddenly caught by the sounds of a bustling arrival. Standing before her were the elite women of Koichi's party, the fierce swordswoman Marika, the crimson mage Flare Crimson, and the serene priestess Beatrix Regan, welcoming the rest of the temple back. The party enthusiastically reported the success of their hunt in the green maze, showing off the impressive bicorn they had vanquished. Rika then inquired about Koichi's whereabouts, only to be informed that he was inside a nearby room alone with Mion. Struck by sudden jealousy, The trio burst into a panicked sprint, shouting Koichi's name as they rushed to interrupt whatever was happening. Inside, Koichi was caught in an awkward embrace with a mischievous, feline-eared companion, looking immensely relieved as his comrades barged in. Chaos erupted immediately as the women began bickering over him, pulling him in every direction while the cat girl clung to his side, pleading for rescue from their terrifying wrath. Reflecting on those lively days at the temple, Falk remembered how everyone was bound together by their shared devotion to Koichi, uniting their efforts to protect the world. That lively harmony shattered when Koichi suddenly collapsed from a mysterious illness. As doctors and mages gradually lost hope, his companions abandoned their monster hunting, desperately searching far and wide for a cure to save his life. As he lay bedridden, a new hero substitute was summoned to take his place. Marika cautioned that they needed to observe the newcomer without making contact, a precaution Falk initially took as reasonable caution given the unprecedented situation. However, a subtle shift began to ripple through the companions as suspicion took root among them. Seeking answers, Falk approached Marika in the quiet corridors of the temple to voice her concerns. She confronted the swordswoman directly, demanding to know why such terrible acts were being committed against the substitute hero. Before she could process a reply, the cold steel of a blade was suddenly pressed against her throat. Without hesitation, Marika drew her sword and held it at point-blank range, silencing her companion with lethal intent. The cold, unwavering glare, the swordswoman made her allegiance clear. Anyone who betrays Koichi is no friend of theirs. She declared fiercely that the temple exists solely for Koichi and those entirely devoted to him, leaving Falk trembling in shock. Recalling the harrowing memory, Falk realizes with profound regret that dark, corruptive forces had taken hold of the temple from within. Looking at Taigo, she somberly reminds him that he stands as the only one truly fighting on the battlefield right now. Listened quietly as she admitted how the group's single-minded focus on reviving Koichi had led to the systemic hostility directed toward him, offering her sincere apologies for the suffering he endured. Stepping forward with sudden resolve, the spirit archer declared her intention to stand alongside him in battle from this moment on. Caught off guard by her pledge, he stared in shock as she vowed to protect him and fight exclusively for his sake. Yet, despite the sincerity in her eyes, a heavy silence fell between them as her words hit a wall of deep-seated bitterness. Clenching his gloved fist tightly, he rejected her offer, questioning how she could possibly aid him when he had already grown strong enough to stand alone. His voice trembled with anger as he recalled how no one answered his pleas for help in the past, leaving him to carry the burden of the solitary hero by force. Overwhelmed by lingering resentment, he shouted in frustration, demanding to know why she offered assistance now when he no longer required it. Covering his face with a trembling hand, tears began to break through as he begged her to simply leave him in peace. Seeing his profound distress, Falk silently turned away and quietly exited the room, leaving him alone in the dim quietness. Remaining seated in isolation, the young hero stared ahead, heavily burdened by the emotional scars of his solitude. Sat alone in the dim room, cursed softly under his breath, haunted by the bitterness of the evening. Next morning, fully armored and ready to face whatever lay ahead, he opened the door, admitting to himself that the previous night had left a bitter taste in his mouth. To his utter astonishment, Falk was waiting right outside, cheerfully offering him a bright morning greeting. Seeing his bewildered expression, she questioned his surprise, reminding him cheerfully that she had promised a day before they would stand and fight as allies. Standing beside Falk near the teleportation circle, Taigo looked at her with skepticism, questioning her claim that they would be fighting together. He openly questioned whether she genuinely planned to follow him, pointing out that their destination was far too dangerous for someone attempting to show off. Continuing his warning, he explained that signs pointed to a massive monster invasion at Coral Coast, making this upcoming battle exceedingly tough. Unfazed by his harsh assessment, she brightly reassured him that she would be fine and promised to stay out of his way. He sighed heavily, blunt in his assessment that her skills were simply insufficient and that he lacked the leeway to protect her in battle. Fixing her with a stern, unyielding gaze, he declared firmly that he would not step in to save her even if danger overwhelmed her. She met his fierce look with unwavering determination, stating that as long as he took her along, she accepted those conditions. Taken aback by her resolute eyes, he stared at her in silence, Realizing her resolve could not be shaken. Seeing that her mind was completely made up, he conceded and permitted her to do as she pleased, prompting a grateful smile from her. Turning back toward the teleportation altar, he requested immediate passage to Coral Coast while checking if her injuries were healed, to which she cheerfully dismissed any concern as the magic light enveloped them. He stepped out of the light onto the ruined streets of Coral Coast alongside Falk, who immediately drew back her bowstring, her eyes darting around in anticipation of immediate combat. Yet, as they surveyed the crumbling architecture and silent stone monuments, no horde rushed to greet them. The pair stood in total silence amidst the debris, scanning the deserted square with a growing sense of confusion. Lowering her weapon in bewilderment, Falk pointed out that there wasn't a single monster in sight, completely baffled by the eerie calm. Walking forward through the quiet ruins, Tygo explained that prior to a major invasion, the lower-tier beasts often clear out, leaving the area unnaturally quiet in the days leading up to the assault. Disappointed by the lack of action after building up her resolve to demonstrate her skills, Falk began pouting, only for Tygo to suddenly sense a strange presence nearby. Ahead of them sat an armored knight, slumping lifelessly against a wall. As Falk rushed forward to check on the survivor, Tygo raised his hand in alarm and shouted for her to wait. His warning came a second too late, as the suit of armor violently burst open, revealing a grotesque, tentacled monster lurking inside that instantly grabbed hold of Falk. Before the beast could crush her, Tygo moved like lightning, unsheathing his weapon and slicing the tentacled creature into pieces with a single swift strike. She collapsed onto her knees among the remains of the mimic monster, listening in shock as he coldly reminded her of the hidden dangers lurking in this ruined city. Blunt, firm statement hung in the air as he told her that the warriors of the 13th Division simply lacked the skill to survive in such a dangerous place. He gave her a chance to turn back, but she adamantly refused, insisting that she was determined to follow him no matter what. Accepting her decision with a quiet nod, he urged her to hurry so they could press forward. As they walked, she repeatedly called out his name, expressing her heartfelt gratitude to him for saving her life earlier. She jogged to catch up with his steady pace, suggesting that he simply call her Falk from now on. Arriving at a bustling hub, she marveled at the sheer number of heroes gathered, noting how rarely they saw warriors from other temples. All around them, polished and capable heroes strode confidently through the crowded thoroughfare. Amidst the noise of armor and chatter, he quietly admitted to himself how much he despised coming to places filled with such elite figures. The shadow of their presence, he could not stop himself from comparing his own worth to theirs, leaving him feeling deeply miserable. Her attention, however, quickly drifted to the lively market stalls, from sizzling sausages and sweet pudding to merchants shouting offers for battle potions. She noted cheerfully how lively the market was despite the inflated prices during peak business hours, though her companion could only offer a muted agreement as they moved past the vendor stalls. Her quiet walk was suddenly interrupted when loud, incredulous shouts erupted from a nearby group of adventurers gathered around a notice. Posted notice officially confirmed the defeat of the fearsome monster known as the Tower of Greed, a beast that had claimed countless lives. Onlookers stared in disbelief at the image of the felled creature, openly wondering what kind of mighty warrior could have pulled off such an impossible feat. In response, a voice in the crowd revealed that the legendary solitary hero was responsible, sending a jolt of shock straight through the young warrior standing nearby. Across the square, other adventurers continued to exchange tales, comparing their own unreliable heroes to the mythical figure everyone was praising. They envisioned the solitary hero as an imposing icon of masculinity and strength, eager to meet the legendary man in person. Unaware of the commotion's true subject, the archer urged her companion to hurry along toward their destination, trail behind in silent dread, agonizing over the inevitable disappointment everyone would feel if they ever learned that he was the solitary hero. Putting his anxious thoughts aside for the moment, they stepped up to the Tactical Command Center tent to officially introduce themselves to the military staff. Stepped into the Tactical Center alongside Falk, politely announcing their arrival to the knights inside. The atmosphere immediately grew tense as the soldiers turned to glare, warning them not to interfere. Deep inside the tent, a commander scolded a kneeling knight, demanding absolute accountability. The knight bowed low, stuttering out a desperate apology for his failure. Commanding warrior sternly declared that abandoning the populace was a disgrace to anyone calling themselves a knight. Observing the intense exchange, Taigo recognized the formidable presence before them. This was Alexandra Zwart III, the queen of a fallen kingdom ruined by monster invasions. Having sworn vengeance and taken up the blade, her extraordinary military feats earned her renown as one of the realm's premier warriors. She was widely revered as the Queen of Blades, a regal commander whose piercing gaze commanded total obedience. Sensing intruders, she turned her sword poised and demanded to know who was present. The youth calmly presented himself and Falk, stating they were joining the operation. Softening her stance slightly, she introduced herself as Alexandra of the 2nd Temple Warrior Corps, expressing relief at their arrival while Falk listened in awe. She noted with quiet irony the title bestowed upon her by the goddess, resolving not to reclaim her royal designation until her lost land was restored. Turning her gaze back to the newcomers, she asked which temple division sent them and requested their names. Respectfully introduced himself as Taigo Korea of the 13th Division, while Falk nervously echoed his statement. Hearing the name, the commander froze in sudden recognition. Her eyes widened in disbelief, sweat beading on her brow as she realized the renowned hero stood right before her. Her eyes wide with disbelief, the monarch pressed the young man, demanding to know if he was truly the legendary solitary hero. As whispers of the lone hero rippled through the gathered crowd, Alexandra stood resolute, her intense gaze casting an imposing presence over the onlookers. Standing right beside her, Taigo couldn't help but feel intimidated by her stern, unyielding expression. Suddenly, her stern demeanor vanished into radiant excitement as she clapped her hands together, expressing her delight at meeting the famed lone hero. Taken aback by her dramatic shift in tone, he sheepishly admitted his discomfort with the title, questioning what she meant by having heard rumors about him. He went on to passionately complain that the epithet made him sound like a friendless outcast eating alone in a bathroom stall, leaving those around him utterly bewildered. Quickly attempting to steer the conversation back on track, he urged the group to focus on their assignment, while she casually reviewed the map and noted that the prime monster hunting grounds were already claimed. The map revealed the coastal regions of the domain, detailing scattered settlements along the vast coastline. Examining the layout, he pointed out to Falk that the urban sectors were crowded because they offered ample places to hide and fight monsters. Seeing the overcrowded areas, he decided they would claim the quiet beach area instead, to which Falk enthusiastically pledged her full effort. Alexandra questioned the choice since few monsters appeared there, while curiously asking what a beach even was, but he reassured her that taking it easy was ideal for their newest member. He stood silently, deadpan, while the surrounding knights murmured in awe at his bold choice, convinced of his supreme confidence. Stepping forward, Queen Alexandra presented him with a small glass vial, explaining that it would serve as their signal flare, expressing gratitude as they had been planning to send support anyway. Falk examined the small container curiously, asking about its purpose, while Alexandra explained that breaking the vial would release red smoke to alert nearby allies in times of peril. He offered a reassuring smile, pointing out that even if one lost the use of their arms, they could simply stomp on the vial to break it, leaving Falk completely stunned by his extreme pragmatism. Suddenly, a loud commotion broke the conversation as a guard shouted a warning that something massive was approaching their position, prompting Alexandra to order everyone to prepare for combat. Heavy footsteps reverberating across the wooden dock, an unseen figure charged toward them at immense speed, giving him a bad premonition. Boisterous armored warrior emerged from the dust cloud, identified by the guards as the Sun Knight, Dan Bright. Without hesitation, Dan scooped him right off the ground in a powerful embrace, greeting his friend with boisterous cheer. While he protested helplessly in Dan's tight grip, Falk and Alexander demanded that the energetic knight release him immediately. Instead, Dan began spinning him around violently in a dizzying whirlwind, ignoring his cries to stop while ordering the rest of the squad back to their positions. He watched silently as a winged woman descended, firmly scolding Dan for treating him like a child. Descending gracefully from the sky with dark feathers scattering around her, Priesta expressed her genuine joy at seeing both Taigo and Dan again. After being gently set back on the ground, Taigo politely requested to be put down while offering candy to the winged warrior, who cheerfully declined as she returned to full stature. Dan offered an apology, explaining that he had searched for Taigo upon hearing of his presence and couldn't contain his excitement when they finally crossed paths. Priesta chimed in, revealing that she too had been searching from above, making a playful vow to spot him first next time, leaving the young hero somewhat bewildered by their antics. Without missing a beat, Dan began aggressively patting Taigo's head in affection, sparking an exasperated protest from the boy while Priesta looked on attentively. As Dan playfully teased Taigo about being at a convenient height for head pats, the young hero kicked him in annoyance, asking if he was calling him short. Turning her attention away from the playful banter, Priesta closed in on Falk, studying the young archer closely before asking if she was Taigo's companion. Satisfied with Falk's timid confirmation, Priesta accepted the answer and urged her to make sure she takes good care of Taigo during their journey. Falk curiously inquired about Priesta's connection to Taigo. The winged warrior revealed with utmost seriousness that he had saved her homeland. She continued to elaborate on the deep bond she shared with Taigo, explaining that after surviving countless high-stakes missions side by side, he was one of the few companions she could truly trust with her life. Observing him fight, throwing himself into battle as if burning away his very vitality, was as nerve-wracking as it was awe-inspiring. Spreading her impressive feathered wings wide, her expression hardened as she made a solemn vow. She would never forgive anything that dared to harm him, whether it be a monstrous beast or any other threat. Turning to rejoin the group, her sudden display of fierce devotion left Falk stunned and visibly shaken in her wake. Summoning her inner resolve, the young archer stared after the winged warrior and quietly declared that she, too, possessed the firm desire to protect Taigo. The resolute look burning in her eyes, she called out Priesta's name, refusing to be outdone or written off. Meanwhile, Dan grabbed Taigo by the collar in a jovial, rough display of camaraderie, announcing that it was time for them to head out while Taigo fruitlessly struggled to break free. Raising his fist high in encouragement, the Sun Knight wished Taigo the absolute best in the upcoming battle, to which Taigo sharply retorted that Dan had better not throw his own life away recklessly. As Taigo and Falk began walking away toward the town center, Dan lingered behind with Priesta, watching their departure with a contemplative look before asking for her thoughts. He specifically pressed her on what she truly made of a young bowyer, Falk, who was attempting to stand beside the solitary hero. Leaning in close to the heavy knight, she offered a cold, unwavering assessment without a hint of hesitation, declaring that the girl was simply far too weak. Standing beside her, Dan stroked his chin in thought, reasoning that there had to be underlying circumstances behind the current situation. Noted that normally a hero merely exists to grant blessings, allowing other warriors to slay monsters rather than entering the front lines themselves. Dan admitted his deep respect for Taigo, marveling at how a young boy was accomplishing more on the battlefield than most seasoned warriors, prompting Priesta to wonder what truly drove him to risk his life. Priesta recalled making inquiries with the church only to be dismissed, intense hostility flashing in her eyes as she mused about destroying a swordswoman named Marika, though Dan mentioned the 13th Division's discreet presence. Regretting that she hadn't forced answers out of Falk, Priesta's aggressive suggestion made Dan interject that she had gone too far, stressing instead that they must simply be prepared whenever Taigo required their strength. Appreciating Dan's steadfast resolve, Priesta heartily agreed to turn their focus toward tearing apart the monsters threatening the land. Meanwhile, walking along a quiet forest trail, Falk noticed Taigo's unusual silence and gently asked if he was all right. Quickly brushing off her concern with a nervous wave, she listened as he stoically reminded her that monsters wouldn't wait for them if they hesitated. Catching up to his side, she hesitantly brought up whether he had reported the details regarding the 13th Division, trailing off in suspense. Glancing back with a cold, intense gaze, he sharply questioned what exactly there was to tell, implying that everyone was merely slacking off and abandoning their duties. Revealed with a weary breath that he had indeed reported the issue to the church, only to be dismissively told to handle it himself. Surprised, Falk pressed further, asking why he hadn't shared his burdens with Priesta and the rest of their companions. Continuing forward, the young hero quietly explained his logic, reasoning that one shouldn't burden friends with the disgrace of their own division, nor bring up painful topics that would only cause them distress. Though Fall conceded that his reasoning made sense on paper, she earnestly protested that taking on everything alone only made his own burden far heavier. He fell silent for a moment, acknowledging her words before casting his eyes downward. Looking up toward the bright sky with a calm, unwavering gaze, he reaffirmed his resolve, knowing full well that this was the difficult path he had chosen for himself. Reflecting on his past life, Taigo confessed that back in his original world, he had always been consumed by a deep sense of boredom. Falk listened attentively as he admitted that his decision to come here stemmed from that emptiness. He recalled lying on his bed, endlessly staring at his phone screen with nothing to be proud of or passionate about, trapped in a mundane existence. The goddess Sanlus extended her divine invitation to become a hero and save the world. He had accepted it blindly, driven by a vague, naive dream. Yet, despite his hopes, he felt he had failed at every turn, unable to accomplish a single thing right since his arrival. Acknowledging that he had never devoted himself to anything before, he reasoned that his current struggles might be a fitting punishment for trying to use another world merely as an escape. Listening to his self-deprecation, Falk was overcome with emotion, shouting that his reasoning was wrong and pointing out how much he continuously suffered on the battlefield. Tears welling in her eyes, she earnestly insisted that he was trying harder than anyone else, refusing to let him undermine his own efforts. Touched by her words, the young hero admitted that while this was not the heroic journey he had envisioned, he was determined to see it through. As they stood together in the quiet forest, he reaffirmed his resolve, knowing that surrendering now would render his presence in this world entirely meaningless. Looking forward, he accepted that he could no longer rely on the 13th Division, yet vowed to maintain their sanctuary until Koichi finally awakened. He contemplated the future, explaining that once Koichi awakened, he would likely move on to another temple, at which point he hoped to become a true hero. Hearing this, Falk tentatively asked if she could accompany him when that day arrived. He pragmatically reminded her that they first needed to survive the day. She pressed closer, unable to hide her eager anticipation for a promise to journey together. Tears welled up in her eyes as she gave a heartfelt smile, enthusiastically swearing to give her absolute best by his side. Urging her to dry her tears so they could keep moving, he led the way out toward the open landscape, though she playfully insisted she was not crying. Before them opened a breathtaking view of the sparkling shoreline, tucked between rugged coastal cliffs where sunlight danced upon the waves. Stepping out onto the stone ledge, Falk gasped in utter awe at her very first sight of the endless ocean. She shared that having been raised in a secluded forest village, she had only ever heard tales of the sea from traveling merchants, and seeing it in person had always been her dream. Even as she marveled at its stunning beauty, he somberly reminded her that this peaceful shore remained an active battlefield. He reasoned internally that monsters had no regard for scenic landscapes, though he anticipated only weak beasts would wander into this vicinity. Turning back to him with a radiant smile, she suddenly reached out, holding out a small token to present to him. She presented a pair of intricate blessing rings, explaining that if each of them wore one, her attacks would gain the magical properties needed to affect monsters directly. Questioned about where she had obtained such artifacts, she sheepishly confessed that she had secretly borrowed them from Marika's hidden stash the day before. As soon as they slipped the bands onto their fingers, a vibrant glow radiated from the metal, confirming the magical link between them had been successfully established. Encouraged by the successful bonding, the young archer excitedly declared this the fresh start of her journey as a warrior. But their moment of celebration was cut short as a sudden disturbance crested the ocean waves. Sensing the immediate threat, Taigo braced himself and activated his bone armor, fully transforming into his battle form as dark chains wrapped around his torso. The erupting seawater, a monstrous reptilian creature known as a scale man, bounded onto the shore, fixing its gaze upon the pair. Without warning, the beast unleashed a relentless flurry of razor-sharp projectiles directly at Taigo, who raised his gauntlets to absorb the incoming strike. Violent explosion detonated across the beach, shrouding the battlefield in smoke and debris. Yet as the dust cleared, Taigo stood completely unharmed within his sturdy armor, while the monster grinned wickedly at the onslaught. Falk watched in amazement as Taigo absorbed every single hit without bothering to dodge, and with the initial barrage failing to leave even a scratch, Taigo prepared to deliver his counterattack. He retaliated with violent precision, slicing through the massive creature in a spray of dark blood, while Falk looked on in shocked awe. Recognizing the danger of the situation, he ordered Falk to fall back into the forest and provide ranged support, to which she hesitantly agreed. Because of the commotion, a fresh wave of scaled, fish-like monsters emerged directly from the ocean's surf. Surrounded on all sides, the armored warrior noted with grim determination that the beastly horde simply refused to stop coming. Meanwhile, explosions erupted in the distant cityscape, confirming that the invasion had spread well beyond the shoreline. Swinging his weapon in a wide arc to cleave another attacker in two, he reflected on the nature of these creatures, knowing they required neither food nor reproduction to exist. As more blood splattered across his armor, he realized that these monsters possessed no intelligence or capacity for peaceful coexistence. Raising his blade with fierce resolve, he concluded that their sole instinct was to eradicate humanity completely. The savage smile breaking across his face, he realized there was no longer any reason to hold back his full strength against such mindless beasts. Unleashing a devastating strike, the swordsman tore through the encroaching monsters in a violent flash of steel. As he carved through the front line, a pair of reptilian-scale men broke past his guard, their cold eyes locking on a Falk standing defenseless near the tree line. Noticing the breach immediately, he bellowed a warning to Falk as the beast leapt forward, its claws outstretched. The creature closed the distance rapidly, charging straight toward the young archer with relentless speed. Her eyes widened in sudden panic as the monstrous threat lunged into view. She lowered her gaze, haunted by the feeling that she had been entirely useless ever since Taigo arrived at the temple. Though she lamented the time she had wasted feeling helpless, a spark of resolve flickered inside her. Refusing to let self-doubt anchor her any longer, her expression shifted from hesitation to fierce determination. Sharp focus, she locked her gaze onto the incoming monster. Drawing back her bowstring in one fluid motion, she prepared to take her shot. A surge of brilliant energy began to envelop the arrowhead, charged with her newfound determination. She narrowed her eyes with fierce determination, pulling the bowstring taut as magical energy coalesced at the arrowhead, fully resolved not to waste another. Drawing her bowstring back with absolute precision, Falk locked her sights onto the looming reptilian monster before her. As the beast advanced, she called upon the wind spirits to imbue her arrow with magical energy. Releasing her seeker shot, the magic-infused projectile pierced straight through the monster's foot, halting its charge. Despite her hit, the creature merely shook off the injury and leaped dangerously close, overwhelming her with its speed. Paralyzed by fear as its massive claw reached out, she realized with dread that her attack was not enough to stop it. Suddenly, Taigo intercepted the beast, cleaving it in half with a brutal downward strike. Looking back at the stunned archer, he checked on her safety after dealing the lethal blow. Giving a thumbs up, he praised her spirit and effort in facing the dangerous monster. Her heart swelled with relief and admiration as she responded with a bright, enthusiastic smile. Acknowledging his command, she prepared to cover him as he barked instructions to keep providing ranged support while the reptilian horde swarmed around them. Without missing a beat, he whirled into action, carving a devastating arc through the ranks of the advancing beasts. As he expertly struck down another creature, she drew back her bowstring, maintaining her sharp focus from a safe distance. Expressing her gratitude for his timely rescue, she watched as he seamlessly continued his relentless onslaught through the enemy forces. Amid the chaos, he silently reflected on his companions, noting that despite his harsh assessment of their skill, they still placed their trust in his leadership. Seeing the overwhelming numbers approaching, he unleashed a special technique known as the slaughtering storm wheel, sending spinning blades slicing through the air. Assuming the massive wave had been neutralized, his moment of relief was suddenly shattered when a low growl echoed nearby, and she called out a warning. A new group of heavily armored reptilian warriors emerged from the smoke, far larger and more dangerous than the common foot soldiers. Identifying them as Lagoon Knights, she voiced her shock, while he realized that encountering such formidable foes on the beach signaled something deeply amiss. Engaging the heavy creature in direct combat, he quickly felt the immense toughness of its armored defense as their weapons violently clashed. As debris shattered around him, the young warrior shouted a sharp warning to his companions while bracing against the ongoing onslaught. Calling out over the din of battle, he instructed Falk to force their enemies to look up toward the sky. Understanding his strategy immediately, the archer readied her bow with a firm nod. Without hesitation, Falk drew back her string, unleashing a glowing magic projectile that shot straight into the clouds through a shimmering crest. High above, her magical barrage erupted into a salt rain, showering down a localized storm of piercing light directly over the reptilian ranks. Caught off guard by the sudden downpour of energy, the armored monsters tilted their heads skyward, completely absorbed by the brilliant distraction. Taking full advantage of their opening, Taigo dropped low to the earth and pressed his open hand firmly onto the terrain. He unleashed his bone armor in a full transformation, forcing vicious black spines to erupt outward from the soil. Technique expanded violently into a massive forest of sharp branches known as Dragon Spine, impaling the surrounding lagoon knights in an instant. Surrounded by a dense barrier of dark, jagged thorns, Taigo stood uninjured at the center of his devastating creation. Examining a fragment of bone resting in his palm, he offered a confident smirk, pleased to finally test out the formidable technique in battle. He stood proudly beside Falk as she stared in absolute shock at the utter devastation wrought by his brutal attack. Surveying the silent, bone-riddled shore, they wondered aloud if their joint offensive had wiped out every last enemy force. Before they could relax, a massive armored warrior descended from the skies like a hawk, catching both heroes completely off guard. Instantly, Taigo raised his blade to intercept the heavy, crushing strike, taking the full brunt of the samurai-like intruder's ambush. Landing fluidly, the imposing commander mocked Taigo, expressing mock admiration that the famous lone hero could slaughter so many men. Stepping forward onto the bloodied shore, the dark warrior prepared to introduce himself properly to the gathered heroes. Formally declared his title as captain, a Demon Sea general serving directly under the dreaded Abyss Duke. Acknowledging the hero's prowess, the general noted that landing on these shores was meant to be an easy flank, though he dismissed the loss of his lower-tier troops. Unfazed by the ruin of his original strategic plan, the general casually remarked that soldiers are completely expendable and easily replaced. Drawing his sword with murderous intent, the general lunged forward, demanding that the young hero entertain him in battle. He unleashes a fierce, violent strike, sending dark waves crashing across the ground as Taigo leaps into the air to dodge the lethal force. The impact detonates with explosive force, blasting dirt and debris everywhere. Landing swiftly, the young hero realizes that turning his back on this opponent meant certain death, forcing him to immediately brace for defense. No time to lose, he raises his shield, blocking an enormous incoming claw attack just in time. The armored general relentlessly presses forward, swinging his massive weapon while Taigo desperately repels the overwhelming blows. Locking blades up close, the general boasts that his opponent will feel the full fury of the water demon's sword granted to him by Lord Apicius. Pushed back by the raw power, the hero recognizes the danger and decides to keep his distance, minimizing damage while waiting for the right moment to strike. Repositioning across the sandy shore, both combatants lock eyes, assessing each other in a brief lull before the next clash. Swirling water suddenly erupts around the general's dark blade, channeling immense aquatic magic into his weapon. The fierce roar, he swings the water-infused sword, unleashing a deadly, surging wave directly at his opponent. The city district of Coral Coast, sudden chaos erupted as monstrous sea creatures cornered helpless civilians pleading for their lives. Without hesitation, one of the beasts impaled a man with its spear, leaving a nearby woman trembling in utter terror as it turned its glowing eyes toward her. Before the monster could strike again, Sun Knight Dan Bright shattered its head with a crushing blow from his weapon, immediately checking on the terrified young lady. Bright flames engulfed the surrounding area as he unleashed his holy energy, illuminating the darkened streets and burning away the attacking monsters. Particles of glowing light spread across the ground, bathing the fallen civilians in a soothing, divine radiance. Surprised by his sudden recovery, a wounded citizen watched his injuries heal completely, while Dan explained that the light of vitality had saved him just in time. The man expressed his deep gratitude. The knight jovially brushed it off, reminding him that humans must always protect and support one another. Raising his shield and weapon high, he roared a bold challenge across the battlefield, proudly declaring that Dan Bright never retreats nor hides from danger. Meanwhile, high above the quiet town rooftops, Priestess swept through the sky with her dark feathered wings. Spotting a giant, floating blowfish monster hovering over the alleyways, her sharp gaze locked onto her target with deadly focus. Unleashing her sharp wings, she launched a volley of feather darts directly toward the floating blowfish beast. A desperate bid to defend itself, the creature puffed up its spiky body with a startled squeal. Sharp projectiles struck with radiant force, causing a bright explosion high in the sky. Overwhelmed by the blow, the dazed monster plummeted toward the town square below. Uttering about how sloppy the monster's assault had been, the winged warrior charged divine power into her greaves as she dove straight after it. Executing her lethal technique, Storm Talon, she struck the giant beast, shattering it into pieces with tremendous force. Landing gracefully, she swore to eliminate any monster that dared defile the pristine sky. Meanwhile, down in the shopping district of Coral Coast, a swarm of bipedal shark monsters began swarming through the vacant streets. Watching the creatures approach with a smirk, Katie of the Akusa Empire Magic Knight Squad, Iron Cat, announced that their test subjects had finally arrived. She bickered playfully with her towering armored companion before preparing to launch their combat experiment against the invading horde. Companion, Sean from the Heavy Magic Artillery Squad, responds lazily to her energetic declaration, clearly unbothered by the approaching threat. Katie steps forward, ordering Sean to sit back and watch while she handles the swarm of land-dwelling sea monsters alone. She marches directly toward the hungry land sharks. Sean teases her about her petite stature, prompting an annoyed outburst from the twin-tailed warrior. Without hesitation, Katie leaps into the fray, her mana claws flashing bright as she slices through the shark monsters with terrifying speed and precision. Admiring her own handiwork after tearing the creatures apart, she proudly boasts about the power of her Phantasma-style mana claws. Observing the bloody scene from behind, Sean remarks nonchalantly on how fired up her senior officer seems to be. Suddenly, a bizarre wooden structure comes rolling down the street, a giant fish cannon mounted on wheels. Noticing the strange new arrival, Sean decides it is finally time to join the battle and readies her heavy artillery weapon. As the fish cannon charges up and fires a projectile directly at her, Sean stands her ground calmly without dodging. The single effortless shot from her heavy magic cannon, Sean completely obliterates the incoming projectile and the enemy artillery in a massive burst of force. She noted with quiet detachment that standard attacks were useless against a fixed defensive barrier, standing calmly within her glowing force field. Without hesitation, she leveled her heavy magic artillery and fired a powerful blast, easily shattering the defensive barrier. Katie urged her to keep moving forward, grumbling about what a hassle the entire affair was as another massive explosion erupted behind them. Meanwhile, along the sandy shoreline of Coral Coast Beach, another fierce battle was reaching a brutal climax. High above the surf, the armored hero extended his blade across the distance, striking directly at the sea captain standing on the sand. Coughing up blood in shock, the masked general stared in disbelief as the hero's sword lengthened unexpectedly to pierce him. Pressing the advantage, the hero unleashed his slaughtering storm wheel attack, hurling giant razor-sharp spinning saw blades directly at his opponent. Devastating technique struck with massive force, triggering an explosion that blew the armored general backward. Despite the devastating impact, the demon general stood back up, his menacing mask peering out from the dust without hesitation. Hoisting his heavy saw blade weapon overhead, the hero closed in to finish the duel against the relentless sea commander. Stood his ground as the towering enemy commander stepped forward onto the sandy shore, preparing to engage in close combat. Acknowledging the hero's impressive effort, the armored general drew his blade, his damaged helmet exposing a single, menacing eye before striking with fierce momentum. The brutal, unexpected strike, the general smashed his heavy weapon directly into his young opponent, catching him completely off guard. The force of the impact knocked him backward, forcing him to plant his heel firmly in the dirt while coughing up blood from the severe blow. Before he could recover, the general invoked a dark spell known as Coral Bind, causing thick, rigid coral branches to sprout rapidly from the ground and trap him. Entangled in the inescapable barrier, he found himself entirely immobilized. While nearby, Falk watched in panic, helpless as arrows bounced harmlessly off the enemy's armor. Trapped securely within the coral, he could only look up in shock as the monstrous general raised his giant blade to deliver a fatal strike. The general peered down cold-heartedly through his shattered mask, showing no mercy as he prepared to cut down the helpless substitute hero. Realizing her arrows were completely ineffective, Falk panicked, coming to the grim realization that she needed to call for reinforcements immediately. Knowing his time was short, he screamed with all his remaining strength, urging Falk to flee and save herself from the impending catastrophe. As he lay helplessly bound, his masked tormentor leaned down close, taunting him not to look away, mocking the utter solitude of his impending end. Without warning, a massive, jagged eruption of crystalline coral violently detonated from beneath the ground, tearing through the air in a brutal display of sheer destructive force. Shockwaves struck the young hero head-on, ripping an agonizing cry from his throat as the blunt force shattered his remaining defenses. Hurled through the air like a ragdoll, he skidded heavily across the dirt, leaving a long groove in the earth as his weapon flew uselessly from his grip. Watching the devastating impact unfold, Falk screamed his name in sheer panic, her heart seizing as she realized how close death was approaching. Her eyes widened in horror as tears welled up, consumed by a crushing wave of guilt, believing her insistence on joining this journey had made her nothing more than a fatal burden. Standing over the battered warrior, the Demon Sea General towered relentlessly, declaring that destroying humanity's beacon of hope would plunge all mankind into eternal despair. Raising his massive katana high above his head with both hands, the executioner prepared to strike the final blow, bellowing his intent to claim the head of the lone hero. The fierce bid farewell, the armored general lunged forward, blade raised to strike his opponent. As the blade descended, Taigo remained steadfast, calculating his move under his helmet. A sudden flash, blood sprayed across the air as Taigo counterattacked, catching the general completely off guard. Surprised by the sudden strike, the demon captain gasped as Taigo executed his technique, Dragon Spine. Stepping back, Taigo watched as the general reeled from the damage, maintaining a wary posture. Suddenly, thick wooden briars burst from the ground, trapping the demon general inside a dense cage of thorns. Seizing the moment, Taigo pulled out a potion and downed it quickly, grimacing at the foul taste while invoking the power to restore his murderous blade. Violent surge of energy surged through his body as the restoration took effect, causing him to grunt in sheer agony. Overwhelmed by intense pain, he collapsed to his knees, screaming out while wishing he had some form of anesthetic for the ritual. Trapped within the thorn cage, the demon general expressed genuine surprise that Taigo could endure his ultimate attack and still recover so quickly. Trapped within the entangling thorns, he could only laugh bitterly, acknowledging the excruciating toll the previous assault had taken on his internal organs and ribs. He noted that while most famed heroes hide away in their temples, this substitute had dared to step onto the battlefield himself, causing unexpected trouble for their forces. Surprised by the unexpected praise amidst a deadly clash, the young hero wondered why the legendary 13th Corps held such a distant, unyielding reputation among allies and foes alike. Despite his continuous efforts to grow stronger by slaying monsters independently, he knew that the veterans of the Corps still refused to accept him as a true comrade. The chilling glare, the armored commander declared that their entire campaign was meticulously planned for a single purpose: to crush humanity's lingering hopes. Unfazed by the sinister declaration, the young warrior coldly, sarcastically thanked him for going to all that pointless trouble. A fraction of a second, a blinding flash of energy erupted between the two combatants, signaling the immediate resumption of their fierce duel. Blades clashed violently in a burst of kinetic shockwaves, their movements blurring as each warrior poured raw force into the deadlock. Taunt after taunt was exchanged amidst the fury, with the general threatening to encase his fallen body in coral to display as a trophy once the battle ended. Exchanging swift strikes while leaping across the terrain, the youth caught a fleeting glimpse of the distance, silently relieved that his archer companion had managed to escape to safety. Far from where he was locked in combat, she peered through the dense foliage, refusing to abandon him. Looking out across the forest floor, she realized with growing despair that both warriors had moved beyond her sight. Tears welled in her eyes as self-doubt took hold, feeling as though her desire to help had only turned her into a burden. Slapping her cheeks firmly, she forced away her grief, resolving that there was no time for tears when there was still a role she could play. With absolute conviction, she swore that if she could be of any use to him, she would willingly risk her life. Meanwhile, the duel raged on in a violent clash of steel, sparks flying with each high-speed exchange. Demon Sea General burst into maniacal, chilling laughter, his grotesque fervor filling his opponent with utter disgust. Refusing to yield, the young hero re-engaged with fierce determination, drawing the enemy's fury away so the injured could be evacuated safely. General reveled in the adrenaline of the clash, confessing a twisted affection born from the thrill of their life-or-death struggle. Unleashing his catastrophic sea serpent frenzy technique, the commander bellowed his warped devotion, sending a tidal fury straight at the steadfast hero. He stood his ground, deftly anticipating the trajectory of every onslaught to slip past fatal injuries. Observing his uncanny reflexes, the demon general grew increasingly astonished by the boy's ability to evade his deadly strikes. Exploiting the briefest opening, the young warrior launched himself upward, delivering a sharp upward strike that caught his armored foe off balance. Pressing the advantage without a moment's hesitation, he closed the distance and landed a heavy direct hit against the general's midsection. The impact rattled the general, forcing a harsh cough of agony from beneath his dark mask as he staggered backward under the sheer weight of the blow. Instead of faltering, the dark commander gripped his blade tighter, his twisted fascination deepening as he called out Taigo's name with obsession. Ferocious momentum, Taigo swung his heavy gear downward, smashing into the stone floor and kicking up a blinding cloud of dust. Dismissing the tactic as a futile attempt at a smokescreen, the demon general raised his sword high, completely unfazed by the obscured vision. The powerful roar, he unleashed a tremendous arc of water, cleaving through the haze with violent force. As the mist settled, the commander peered forward, expecting to see his adversary crushed, yet finding only silence amidst the clearing dust. In the wake of the devastating strike, the massive rock structure behind them stood sliced completely in two, proving the terrifying power behind the sword strike. Peering into the settling dust, the Demon Sea General grunted in confusion, realizing his target was no longer in sight. Suddenly, a sharp weapon whirled from behind, slicing deep into the general's armored back before he could even react. Blood erupted violently as the blades tore through his flesh, catching the armored commander completely off guard. Watching from a distance, Taigo narrowed his eyes in fierce concentration, declaring that the battle was far from over. Despite the grievous wound, the armored general scoffed, declaring that he held no fear of death and would simply vanish from this world if slain. He laughed manically, stating it would be a waste to end such a thrilling contest so soon. Driven by dark madness, the commander suddenly grabbed the warrior pressing the attack, twisting violently to counter. Gritting his teeth against the bloodthirsty frenzy, Taigo watched as the general screamed for even more pain and bloodshed. General glared back with wild, unhinged intent, locked in a brutal contest of strength. The sudden burst of power, the general managed to hurl his assailant back, forcing them onto the defensive. He revels in the excruciating agony of his wounds, letting out a manic laugh, while thanking his opponent for granting him such overwhelming thrill. Meanwhile, Taigo grimly readies his sword, invoking its divine name to restore its murderous edge. As the Dark General continues his unhinged outbursts, Taigo coldly suggests that if he enjoys the sensation so much, he should simply lie down and die for him. Refusing the offer with a twisted grin, the general insists that this rare opportunity must be savored to the absolute end. Impressed by the dramatic speech, Taigo bluntly cuts him off, stating that he is being annoyingly roundabout in saying he intends to kill him. Suddenly, an immense shockwave erupts around the armored warrior as he declares that defeating a formidable opponent requires bringing out every weapon in his arsenal. As power surges around Taigo, the armored captain announces that his ultimate preparation is about to begin. Before either can strike, a massive shadowy vessel emerges from the stormy sea behind them, catching Taigo completely off guard. Rising out of the crashing waves, the colossal construct reveals itself as the legendary battleship. As a plume of dark smoke rose into the sky, Sun Knight Dan Bright recognized the signal flare coming from the beach. Realizing Taigo was facing a threat severe enough to request immediate reinforcement. Alerting Priesta to the signal, he immediately took off, running down the cobblestone streets toward the shore. Following close behind, Priesta regretted leaving Taigo's side, realizing she should have remained with him regardless of the orders from their hero. Before they could make meaningful progress, a violent impact crashed into the street right between them, shattering the cobblestones and cutting off their path. Examining the crater, Dan observed the fallen figure embedded in the rubble, realizing it was not a monster attack, but a warrior who had plummeted from the sky. Meanwhile, Katie rushed through the alleyways in full panic, desperately urging Sean to keep up as they fled from an overwhelming terror. Reaching the others, Sean frantically explained that a terrifying, incomprehensible entity had suddenly appeared. The group gathered together in the alley, their sense of urgency rising as the atmosphere grew heavy with impending danger. Suddenly, a colossal foot slammed down into the town square with crushing force, destroying structures and freezing the allies in terror. And stared up in utter disbelief as a gigantic, ominous eye loomed directly over them. He stood frozen alongside Priesta as they recognized the monstrous menace before them as a deep-sea fiend, its single eye glaring down while chained arms hovered menacingly above the rooftop. The sudden, violent strain, the cyclopean giant yanked at its heavy iron chains, preparing to hurl its colossal weight into the fray. Giant let out a deafening roar as it smashed through the surrounding structures, prompting Dan to urge Priesta to eliminate the threat quickly so they could reach Taigo. Stealing their resolve, both warriors charged in tandem toward the towering behemoth, ready to unleash their full force. Meanwhile, down on the coast, the armored samurai general stood before the vast ocean, commanding the massive battleship whale to display its true power. Raising his gleaming blade into the air, the commander signaled for the oceanic war engine to initiate its assault. High above, energy gathered in a blinding flash before a catastrophic volley was ordered to fire down upon the battlefield. Devastating bombardment smashed into the terrain, generating a brutal explosion of dust, debris, and kinetic force that engulfed everything in its path. As the smoke slowly cleared, the surrounding forest lay shattered, transformed into a barren wasteland of broken timber and burning ash. Seizing on the distraction, the samurai commander struck violently from behind, warning his opponent never to look away during battle. His ruthless strike collided against his opponent with blinding force, unleashing a flash of sparks between the two combatants. A brutal blow carved directly through the knight's heavy armor, causing blood to splatter as a scream of pain escaped their lips. Observing the resilience before him, the masked general expressed mild surprise that the wounded warrior remained standing, weapon still in hand. Above the battleground, a swarm of dark, ray-like creatures circled around the towering, skyborne battleship whale. Arcing electricity surged along the Leviathan's colossal frame as the shadowy aquatic familiars blanketed the surrounding airspace. Frustrated by the persistent pests swarming overhead, the knight gritted their teeth and maintained a battle-ready posture despite the immense pain. Suddenly, a swift current of dense mist enveloped the warrior, catching them completely off guard as the atmosphere shifted. An ethereal voice echoed from within the fog, invoking the water spirit sword's secret mist technique to unleash an unseen terror. Realizing this hidden assault was retribution for earlier events, the knight scrambled to deflect the invisible slashes closing in from all directions. A barrage of razor-sharp water blades erupted around the defender, cutting deep into their armor and tearing through flesh in a devastating storm. The relentless water mist allowed electric ray spirits to glide silently through the fog, shocking the Horned Knight as he realized the true nature of the trap. Caught off guard by another incoming strike, Dan caught sight of a faint, mocking smirk shimmering beyond the mist. Refusing to yield, he roared back at his aquatic adversaries, declaring that they had severely underestimated his wrath. Unleashing his power, he activated the Slaughter Storm Zone, sending razor-sharp gear blades spinning through the air to shred everything in their path. The colossal dark whale materialized to crush him. Dan braced himself, boasting that he could easily read its movements. With blinding speed, he struck back against the giant shadow, driving his counterattack straight into the center of the fray. The giant whale let out a bellow of pain as Dan's fierce strike carved deep into its formidable frame. Recognizing the toughness of his foe's skin, he noted that his blade was still sharp enough to pierce through its heavy defense. Shouting a fierce taunt at the behemoth, he unleashed a barrage of rapid slashes, his eyes burning with unshakable determination. The massive creature reeled in agony from the devastating impact, sent crashing backward as Dan pushed the offensive without hesitation. Blood dripped steadily onto the cold ground as the masked general stood silently, observing the aftermath of the brutal exchange. Kneeling under the weight of his severe injuries, he forced himself to invoke the restoring power of his blade to heal his broken body. As he groaned through the intense agony of his recovery, the enemy commander watched in quiet disbelief at such unnatural resilience. General bluntly remarked that something was deeply wrong with his opponent's relentless drive to keep standing. Annoyed by the commentary, he shot back, griping about receiving backhanded compliments, while the general acknowledged that few had ever survived receiving so much damage from him. General pressed further, questioning why he was staking his very life for a world that shouldn't mean so much to him, prompting a defensive counter-submission on why protecting it was so wrong. The enemy taunted if a lover was the cause of his motivation. He sternly dismissed the claim, threatening fatal retribution if the commander continued making light of his resolve. Clarified that even without a lover, he had forged bonds with allies and acquaintances in this realm, people whose lives he refused to let the invaders cut short. Dark memories of slaughter and suffering flooded his mind, reinforcing his foundational belief that monsters were mindless threats meant solely for eradication. With unyielding conviction shining in his gaze, he prepared to reveal the final, crucial truth behind his unwavering stance. As he reflected on everything that had transpired, memories of the allies who depended on him flashed clearly before his eyes. The young hero, a tearful goddess, and the radiant divine presence. Recalling every companion he had met along the way, he understood that transported into another world did not automatically transform anyone into a legendary figure. The hardship and suffering since arriving in this realm had far outweighed the joy. His resolve remained entirely unshaken. Standing tall in his full suit of armor, Taigo poured his entire soul into an impassioned declaration, crying out that despite everything, he still wanted to become a hero. Demon Sea General observed him in silence as the young man proclaimed that this very dream was the reason he had traveled across worlds, and that surrendering now would leave him with nothing but eternal regret. Steady eyes fixed on his formidable adversary, he vowed never to back down, no matter how powerful the enemy standing before him might be. Behind him on the cold, unforgiving ground, Falk remained collapsed in the brush, resting motionless while her ally made his. Recovering from the immediate danger, Falk pushed herself up from the ground, gasping in disbelief as she realized she had survived. Trembling in the desolate forest, anxiety gnawed at her heart as she confessed her terror and helplessness. Looking toward the distance where her companion stood, she questioned what someone as weak as her could possibly achieve in this fight. Her mind drifted back to Taigo, recalling how he stood resolutely apart from the rest, bearing a heavy burden in silence. She remembered his isolation, how no one came to aid him even when he was treated poorly and cast aside. A wave of guilt washed over her as she remembered her own powerlessness to help him during those painful moments. Despite everything, Taigo continued to fight alone for the sake of their world, unwavering in his resolve. Her eyes widened with sudden clarity as she remembered her personal vow to stand by his side and support him. Determination replaced her fear, and drawing her bow back with magical force, she declared that she would act regardless of her limitations. Channeling her power into dual magical arrows, she unleashed a devastating volley directly into the battlefield below. She bounded across the rugged terrain, her boots sliding momentarily before finding solid footing as she repositioned herself for a clear line of sight. High above the shoreline, she drew back her bow, tracking the massive whale-shaped mechanical vessel anchored in the waters below. Fixating her gaze, a glowing crosshair target materialized, perfectly aligning her vision with the ship's heavy weaponry. The vessel's mounted turret began to swivel, but her eyes locked onto the target with fierce, unwavering determination. Determined to bridge the gap in raw power, she poured every ounce of her life force into the glowing magical projectile. Release. Her wyvern blast struck the vessel with violent precision, erupting into a catastrophic burst of fire and shrapnel. Seeing the damage inflicted, a hopeful smile crossed her face as she prepared her next shot, aiming to destroy the gun turret completely. Without giving the enemy room to breathe, she readied another arrow as water plumes burst violently into the air from the ongoing bombardment. She unleashed a rapid succession of energy arrows, raining destructive blasts onto the warship's deck. Though the barrage was effective, the heavy toll on her body began to show. Sweat beaded on her brow as her stamina rapidly drained away. She drew back her bowstring with determination, reminding herself that the pain she felt was trivial compared to everything Taigo had endured. Massive recoil and impact shook the sea monster's back where she stood, destabilizing her footing amidst the explosive chaos. Losing her balance completely, she slipped off the creature's back and tumbled helplessly through the air. She hit the deck below. The towering armor-clad demon Sea General materialized over her, recognizing her as the archer who had launched the assault. Dark, suffocating aura surged from the samurai commander as he drew his massive blade, coldly asking if she was prepared to meet her demise. Closing her eyes in resignation, she sorrowfully lamented that in the end, she had been of no real help to Taigo. Before the deadly blow could land, Taigo swept in on his motorized gear, snatching her away while taunting the enemy commander to keep his eyes on him. Deploying a dense screen of smoke, they vanished into the tree line, leaving the frustrated general cursing another sudden escape. Upon coming to a halt safely in the woods, she offered him a soft, relieved word of gratitude. In response to her dramatic apology, he affectionately squished and stretched both of her cheeks, cutting off her gloom with a playful scolding. She mumbled out an apology as Taigo scolded her for taking such reckless risks, reminding her that she had come dangerously close to losing her life back there. Pressed further, explaining that she had no duty or obligation to throw her life away for his sake. Falk remained resolute, softly declaring that giving her life for him wasn't an obligation at all, but rather her own choice. With absolute conviction in her eyes, she declared that if he was destined to die, then she wished to die right alongside him. Overcome by her direct declaration, Taigo froze in place, turning around in utter disbelief while Falk stood waiting patiently behind him. Let out a stunned gasp, staring back at her as she tilted her head in confusion. Behind his helmet, a massive blush flushed across his face as panic and overwhelming joy warred within his mind. Composing himself, he turned back to face her, acknowledging her unwavering determination and preparing to make his next request. Stopping in the middle of the forest trail, he asked her to briefly restrict Capitan's movements. She nervously inquired about the price of failure. He grimly responded that in that case, she should die with him. Quickly laid out the plan, instructing her that as soon as he began running after a count of 3, she was to open fire without hesitation. Activating his enhancements, magical energy surged through his legs, preparing him for maximum speed. As he counted down to 2, she drew back her bow with resolute determination, fully aware her body might give out, but deciding to stake everything on this final shot. Reaching the count of 1, he burst forward in a blinding dash toward the armored foe. Demon Sea General stood motionless, coolly watching the approaching attack. He charged headlong with his weapon drawn. She loosed her arrow to support his advance. Sudden streak of energy ripped across the battlefield, signaling the clash. Collapsing to her knees from utter exhaustion, she cried out his name in sheer desperation. Towering warrior easily caught his incoming strike, taunting him for his weakness. Just as the general prepared to end his life, he suddenly found himself frozen in place, unable to move a muscle. Glares back at the young archer, instantly realizing that she has fired her final spirit arrow, and sits completely exhausted on the battlefield. Flexing his dark power, the armored giant shatters the magical arrow restraining him, instantly breaking free from its paralyzing hold. Before he can strike her down, the hero leaps high into the air above him, gripping his massive heavy weapon with absolute resolve. Driving his weight downward, he plunges his polearm directly into the demon general's shoulder plates in a ferocious surprise attack. With a violent clash slashes open his own lower leg, he withstands the agony without flinching, pressing his full weight against the enemy. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain, he maintains his unrelenting pressure as sparks and energy fly between them. At that exact moment, a radiant winged figure streaks through the sky above a massive mechanical whale vessel rested near the shore. Caught off guard by the incoming shockwave overhead, the demon commander glances upward in sudden alarm. Focusing his power to the absolute limit, the young warrior lets out a fierce cry as wind violently whirls around his face. Together with his aerial ally, he brings down a crushing dive attack that detonates right on top of the stunned general beside the massive vessel. He watches as the combined strike lands with immense force, triggering a catastrophic explosion that ruptures the surface of the sea. His gigantic, shadowy tentacles coil out from the turbulent waters behind him. The young warrior skids across the hard ground to stabilize his position. Catching his breath as the massive appendages loom nearby, he sits back in disbelief that their desperate maneuver actually succeeded. Masked General commends his tactical brilliance in outsmarting him to destroy the battleship whale, calling the feat truly splendid. With a weary smile, the young warrior confesses he had been deeply concerned for his well-being and is relieved to see him standing. Before their conversation can continue, the general suddenly senses a new presence and spins around in surprise. Stepping firmly onto the battlefield armed with a flaming torch and heavy shield, Dan Bright declares his arrival to reinforce. Reinforcements finally arrived on the battlefield as Dan Bright charged in to assist, apologizing for the delay while Tygo lay collapsed on the ground, completely exhausted from the brutal fight. Gently descending from the sky, Priesta carried Tygo safely to the ground, offering her sincere apologies for not arriving sooner to spare him from such pain. She held him close. Tygo softly expressed that simply seeing her safe before his time was more than enough for him. Seeing his dire condition, Falk cried out his name in alarm, but Sean restrained her, warning that moving him in his current state was far too dangerous. Katie stepped forward to administer immediate first aid, noting how completely spent both Tygo and Falk were after holding off the ferocious monsters all on their own. As Katie treated his wounds, Tygo winced in pain, gritting his teeth while Sean urged him to endure the sharp sting of the emergency healing. Looking upon the battered young warrior, Sean expressed profound respect for his bravery, formally acknowledging the immense burden he carried as the solitary hero. Alexandra acknowledged that without Tygo holding back the Demon Sea General, their entire force would have been overwhelmed and wiped out. Drawing her massive blade with unwavering resolve, Alexandra reassured the weakened hero that his desperate struggle was not in vain, declaring that she would take over the battle. Nearby, Dan Bright clashed violently against the armored demon captain, shielding his allies and declaring his readiness to punish the formidable opponent. Braced behind his heavy shield as the aquatic commander unleashed a furious flurry of sword strikes, spray and sparks flying from the brutal impact. The Sun Knight absorbed the brunt of the assault. The blade sliced past his defenses, leaving a deep gash across his chest as his opponent grumbled at missing a fatal blow. Taking advantage of the opening, Priesta dove from above with a dive kick, crying out her technique, but the demon general effortlessly parried her assault with a dark tendril. Knocked backward, Priesta clicked her tongue in frustration, while Dan held his ground in front of the armored monstrosity, refusing to yield an inch. Demon Sea General burst into boisterous laughter, mocking the combined efforts of the Sun Knight and the migratory bird. declaring that even together, they were 100 years too early to claim his head. Stepped forward Alexandra, glowing with an ethereal aura as she wielded her massive greatsword with solemn grace. Recognizing her nobility, the demonic warrior mockingly acknowledged her as the former queen whose kingdom was stolen, to which she calmly affirmed her identity. With unflinching resolve, she declared that she vowed never to let anything be taken from her again, charging forward as her foe prepared to meet her blade. She launched into a violent combo, striking his armor repeatedly before summoning a massive surge of water in her technique, Flowing Watermoon. The serene composure, Alexandra channeled her technique, swirling rings of magical light and water enveloping her strike as she drove her sword down upon her opponent. She stood at the center of a radiating wheel of ethereal blades, channeling her supreme magical power into a devastating formation. Unleashing the full force of her technique, Knight of the Round, concentric circles of magical energy spun outward, sweeping through the battlefield. The apex of her spell, a burst of blinding light exploded outward, launching countless radiant swords in every direction. Glowing blades rained down like holy light, slicing through the air straight toward her target. Invoking the legendary Golden Crusader attack, beam after beam of radiant energy descended from the sky, striking around the massive, monstrous general. Sacred blades pierced the earth and plunged directly into the demon commander's limbs, pinning him tightly in place. Though immobilized with blades piercing his body, the general smirked wickedly, believing he had lured her right into a trap. Activating his secret technique, Coral Bind, sinister roots burst from the ground around the embedded swords, entangling her constructs. Taunted that neutralizing her swords effectively halved her fighting strength, though one of his own armored arms had been severed in the clash. She coldly pointed out that he had just lost an entire arm, but the demonic general merely laughed, declaring he felt all the lighter and refreshed. It scoffed at the loss of his limb, yet Alexandra remained calm, her grip firm on her broadsword as she prepared to press the attack. Lashing out with unrelenting speed, she drove her blade forward, refusing to give the armored general a single moment to recover. The ancient runic inscriptions etched along the flat of her sword began to glow softly, carrying the heavy weight and heritage of her fallen kingdom, Beowulf. Radiant energy enveloped the massive weapon, as she declared that no adversary had ever survived a true strike from this sacred blade. In response, the general summoned his dark martial art, manifests giant crab-like pincers known as grindle hands from the surrounding air. Massive claws snapped forward, meeting her charge in a fierce clash of brute force and magical energy. Leaping high into the air above the reach of the chitinous pincers, she positioned herself directly above the standing warrior. With absolute resolve burning in her eyes, she swore that she would never accept defeat until her conquered homeland was restored to its former glory. Bringing her radiant blade down in a devastating overhead strike, she unleashed her ultimate technique, Kingdom Blade. As the smoke cleared, the general stood firm in a low defensive stance, bracing against the crushing force of her sacred strike. He recognized the desperate pinch they were trapped in, his gloved hand gripping his weapon with fierce intensity. Glaring through his armored helmet, his thoughts turned to the young hero who had constantly defied impossible odds. Questioned whether that brave youth would ever give up in a moment like this, recalling his unyielding desire to become a true hero. Refusing to succumb, the armored commander roared a defiance that echoed across the dark battlefield, pushing back against the overwhelming tide. In response, Alexandra unleashed her ferocious great whale slayer technique, driving her illuminated blade directly into the dark, monstrous appendages. As her steel severed the shadow tendrils, she kept her sharp gaze fixed on her opponent, unyielding amidst the chaos of combat. Seeing the opening, Dan Bright shouted words of backup as he and Priesta advanced through the swirling flames and dark energy. Alexandra locked weapons with the Demon Sea General in a tremendous collision of raw force and sparking edges. Remembering how the solitary hero, Tygo, had put his entire life on the line for their world, both Alexandra and Dan strengthened their resolve. Priesta stood steadfast with her dark wings outspread, swearing to fight on for the sake of Tygo, their true hero. Driven by absolute resolve, she and her allies agree that as long as victory is achieved here, they are prepared to throw away their very lives. Combined fury, Alexandra and Dan pour everything into a decisive blow against the Demon Sea general, refusing to back down. The force of their collision shatters the general's dark constructs into countless flying fragments. Amidst the violent explosion of dark debris, both Alexandra and the armored general glare through the wreckage, their resolve unshaken. As the dust settles, the general stands battered, his shadowy appendages dropping away onto the scorched earth. Yet, refusing to accept defeat, the general crushes a magical artifact in his hand, declaring that the battle is far from over. Unleashing a desperate final technique, currents drag on Riot Fong. He triggers a massive spinning vortex of surging energy centered upon himself. Devastating shockwave expands outward, knocking Alexandra, Dan, and Priesta off their feet as they cry out against the violent torrent. Silence falls over the devastated battlefield as smoke clears, revealing the scorched, cratered wasteland left in the wake of the explosion. Exhausted and battered, Alexandra collapses to her knees while Dan and Priesta lie incapacitated on the ground, having given everything to survive the general's final strike. As the smoke clears from the battle, the monstrous samurai warrior stands victorious, chuckling darkly through his fanged mask as he prepares to savor his triumph. Leaving the clash is entirely over. He raises his blade with cold certainty, confident that no foe remains to challenge him. Suddenly, blood spurts violently as his severed arm flies through the air, catching him completely off guard as a wave of sheer shock washes over his face. Unable to comprehend the impossible turn of events, he recoils in disbelief, questioning how anyone could have delivered such a fatal blow. Through his failing vision, he gazes upon Taigo, bloodied and battered, yet standing resolute with a fierce, unwavering determination in his Demon Sea general was certain he had severed his opponent's leg, leaving no possible way for the hero to stand, let alone move. Shock filled the armored general's eyes as he stared at the unbelievable reality before him. Despite losing his limb, Taigo stood tall, having used the last of his strength to forge a temporary prosthetic leg directly from his armor. Watching the young warrior's impossible display of resolve, the general realized he had severely underestimated his adversary. The ferocious yell, Taigo wielded his massive hammer, revealing himself to be a true warrior driven by sheer willpower. Leaping forward with a deafening roar, he brought his heavy weapon down in a devastating strike. The force of the blow shattered the general's mask, spraying debris as the decisive hit connected. The violence ended. A single drop fell into a profound, tranquil void. Sudden silence washed over the scene, replacing the rage of battle with an eerie serenity overlooking the calm sea. Standing quietly before the vast ocean, the defeated general felt a profound inner peace, his heart as calm as the waters after a storm. He stood quietly before his opponent, expressing profound gratitude that the hero had been his final adversary in this long, brutal struggle. Though he considered himself nothing more than a monster, he offered a quiet prayer, wishing eternal victory for the hero who had bested him. With ripples of fading energy expanding outward, his single blinding flash, Taigo delivered a devastating strike, cleaving his foe cleanly in two. General's severed head tumbled through the air, dark blood spraying from the fatal wound. Taigo looked on with a solemn expression, bidding a quiet farewell to the defeated warrior. As dark tendrils of smoke dissolved into the atmosphere, the massive dark entity vanished over the shoreline, leaving only the quiet expanse of the sea. Overcome by sheer exhaustion and the strain of battle, Taigo collapsed onto his back as frantic cries of his name echoed from afar. Companions gathered around him immediately, relieved to find him breathing and safe. Looking up at the familiar faces assembled above him, including Falk and all his allies, Taigo recognized the emotional support and relief in their tear-filled eyes. His eyes heavy with exhaustion, the young hero slowly broke the silence as his allies gathered around him. Lying helpless on the ground while surrounded by his weeping companions, he casually inquired if anyone happened to know where his severed right leg had landed. Spurred into action, the party frantically searched the battlefield until Katie joyfully held up the missing limb, while the rest rushed to return it for immediate treatment. Meanwhile, the dying enemy general drew his final breath, remarking with grim satisfaction that the ancient curse was finally broken before bidding an ultimate farewell to Taigo. Sometime later, high above the quiet courtyard of the Grand Palace. Calls echoed through the halls, instructing everyone to gather immediately. Inside an opulent bedchamber, loyal companions overflowed with tears of joy as they surrounded a bed, calling out the name of their long-dormant comrade. Blinking against the morning light, Koichi slowly opened his eyes to find his friends tearfully embracing him, utterly confused by the overwhelming commotion upon his sudden awakening. Word spread like wildfire throughout the grand corridors of the castle. The true hero had revived at last, leading onlookers to declare that a temporary substitute was no longer required. Sitting up in bed, Koichi listened intently as his companions gently brought him up to speed on everything that transpired during his deep slumber, including the existence of a substitute hero. Moments later, Taigo entered the spacious chamber alongside his party, where Koichi offered a warm, polite greeting to the brave youth who had carried his burden in his absence. He offered a smooth, polite smile, thanking the substitute for everything he had done up until now in his place. Surrounded by admiring women on either side, his pleasant demeanor vanished as he cold-heartedly ordered the former proxy to leave. As the harsh demand echoed through the room, the surrounding companions watched in stunned silence while the discarded hero turned to depart. Without a single word of protest or resentment, he simply accepted his sudden dismissal with a calm compliance. Before he could take another step, Falk stepped forward, resolve in her eyes, declaring firmly that she would be leaving with him. The unexpected proclamation sent a shockwave through the room, leaving the young man himself utterly speechless at her unwavering loyalty. Hearing her choice, the true hero's composed facade completely shattered, his face twisting in a violent burst of disbelief and anger. In response to his outburst, Alexandra lashed out furiously, sternly reminding him that the archer had made her intentions clear long ago. Drawing her blade in a flash of cold steel, she pressed the sharp tip directly against Falk's neck, demanding to know if she was truly willing to betray her comrades. Unflinching beneath the blade held to her throat, Falk gently reassured Taigo that her decision was absolute now and forever. She declared unwavering devotion to Taigo, proudly proclaiming herself as warrior despite the sharp steel held at her throat. Hearing her declaration, the young substitute hero stared back in utter shock, a faint blush and wide eyes betraying the deep impact of her words. Alexandra, however, reacted with growing outrage, accusing her of not only betraying Koichi, but making a complete fool of him. Tension spilled over into the rest of the room, leaving the surrounding companions in sheer disbelief at the unfolding chaos. Driven to the brink by jealousy, Koichi snarled that Taigo was merely a temporary stand-in who was now attempting to steal everything that belonged to him. Veins bulged on his furious face as he screamed that everything in the temple was his and that he would never yield a single thing. He berated Taigo for getting arrogant simply because he had played the role of hero for a short while. Accusing Taigo of manipulating Falk, the self-proclaimed true hero gave the order for his allies to attack him immediately. In an instant, several warriors lunged forward simultaneously, blades swinging toward the solitary hero in a violent ambush. With calm focus, Taigo countered seamlessly, deflecting every incoming strike and repelling his attackers with a powerful, decisive surge of strength. As he stood composed amidst the sudden skirmish, Alexandra reeled in surprise as arrows flew toward her, realizing she was being pinned down from afar. Looking up, the Queen of Blades found Falk calmly observing her, realizing to her horror that the archer's magic arrows had struck her shadow, rendering her completely immobile. Executing her shadow-piercing technique with flawless precision, Falk drew cursed Alexandra's fury while Koichi recoiled in sheer terror from the ongoing assault. Turning his gaze toward the bystanders, Taigo sternly warned everyone to evacuate if they wished to avoid injury, prompting Koichi to frantically demand protection from his attendants. Instead of defending him, Koichi's followers abandoned him and fled in terror, ignoring his desperate reminders that his death would brand them all as criminals. Left utterly defenseless, Koichi attempted to offer a feeble apology, but Taigo met his cowardice with cold, unyielding silence. Drawing a massive, saw-toothed mechanical weapon, Taigo prepared to unleash devastating force upon the cowering hero. With a single swift blow, he shattered the structure around them, bringing down massive debris in a powerful display of strength. Standing among the ruined rubble, Taigo coldly reminded Koichi's party of how they squandered resources on luxury, while he single-handedly kept their branch funded through monster hunting. Including his harsh rebuke, Taigo declared that the fate of their corrupt temple was no longer his concern, leaving Alexandra and the remaining companions stunned in silence. He firmly declared his intention to take Falk with him, leaving Koichi stammering in shock while Alexandra could only utter a frustrated groan at her total defeat. Leaving the ruined branch behind, the young hero and his companion walked side by side down a quiet, sunlit path through the countryside. As they walked, he realized a profound truth. Without Falk, Dan, Priesta, Alexandra, Katie, and Sean, he would have perished long ago in this harsh world. Ever since his arrival in this realm, he had lived under the self-imposed belief that being completely alone was enough to survive. Solitary battles had earned him a nickname among the populace. They called him the solitary hero. Yet, when he had tried to express his gratitude to his newfound companions around a warm campfire, they had simply laughed and reminded him that comrades naturally help one another. It made it clear that a true warrior's duty was to stand shoulder to shoulder with the hero, sharing meals and laughter together. He remembered how the lively crew had playfully overwhelmed him, pouring drinks and forcing him into their joyful camaraderie. Even the sternest among them had let down their guards, enjoying the feast and drinking deeply in celebration. Looking back on those moments, he knew in his heart that he was no longer alone, flanked by allies who genuinely cared for him. He reflected deeply on how much it meant to hear someone call him a true comrade, a feeling he never realized he had been yearning for. Memories of celebrating alongside his fellow allies flooded his mind, bringing a warmth and happiness beyond words. As they walked together through the peaceful forest path, she gently agreed with his quiet thoughts, muttered anxiously about no longer being the hero's stand-in and how their different temple affiliations might keep them apart, leaving her slightly puzzled by his nervous rambling. Turning to face her directly with a flushed visage, he asked if she was truly certain about leaving and traveling by his side. She beamed warmly, offering a tender smile as she explained that it was precisely because it was him that she chose to go. Flustered by her clear devotion, he stammered to clarify if she specifically wanted to be with him, to which she reaffirmed her desire. Looking down at the ground between them, his heart raced, overwhelmed by the depth of her sincere feelings. Standing tall opposite her, he finally found the courage to state firmly that it had to be her. Quickly looked away in embarrassment while offering a bashful explanation, leaving her gazing at him with soft affection. Reached out his gloved hand toward her, officially sealing his commitment to forge a new path together. With quiet sincerity, he asked her to rely on him from this moment onward. In response, she gently took his palm into her own, a warm and tender smile illuminating her face as she reaffirmed her mutual trust in him, even as the harsh reality of their hellish world lingered in his thoughts. Standing together beneath the rustling leaves of the forest, she broke the comfortable silence, softly asking what steps they ought to take next. Pondering her question, he looked toward the bright canopy above, well aware of the endless struggles that awaited them, yet resolute in his heart. Stepping forward into the sunlight alongside one another, they shared an unshakable belief that they could overcome any hardship, determined to survive this unforgiving world together as trusted